Good afternoon. Thanks for being with us today, and welcome to our webinar, Students Becoming Scholars, using digital archives to create a powerful primary source assignment. This is Jennifer Trammell with the Readex team, and I'll be facilitating our session. Many of you know Readex as a major publisher of primary source collections, like the Archive of Americana, which includes America's historical imprints. Today, we're excited to have Professor Julie Voss with us to share an assignment she designed to boost student engagement in her Colonial American Literature course. In the next 30 minutes, you'll learn proven tips and techniques for creating an effective digital archives assignment of your own, structuring the assignment to dramatically improve student research skills, and increasing student knowledge, engagement, and enthusiasm. After that, we will have time for questions. On the right side of your screen, you'll see the gray GoToWebinar control panel. Go ahead and look for the chat section near the bottom of that control panel. And if you click the plus sign to expand it, you can just type your question in the box, send it over to me, and we'll be collecting those questions throughout the presentation. During the presentation, you also have access to 3 handouts. Look for the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. You can go ahead and access those documents now and save them to review later. The handouts are a brief overview of Readex's Early American Imprints collections, comments from other faculty and librarians who have used primary sources in the classroom, and our presenter's PowerPoint. Today's discussion is sure to spur some good ideas, so we'd love to keep the conversation going with you on Twitter using the hashtag StudentsBecomingScholars. One final housekeeping note, we are recording today's presentation, and you're going to receive a link to that video. Of course, you're welcome to share that with any faculty or colleagues and friends. Julie Voss is an associate professor of English at Lenoir-Rhyne University in Hickory, North Carolina. Her primary specialty is early American literature, and her articles include the Muslim world in early U.S. texts. Julie tells us her favorite thing about teaching is witnessing those aha moments, when students discover something important to them, and they move from being passive receptors of education to active participants in their own growth. She's found that working with primary texts is often the key to creating those experiences. Professor Voss, we are just thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be part of this. And welcome to all of you who are joining us this afternoon. Thanks for joining us for this presentation. I hope that you will gain some ideas from it for your own work. Before we get started, I'd like to learn a little more about who's joined us today.
Sure, let's go ahead and do a quick poll question. So you should see that question on your screen now. Go ahead and tell us what best describes your position at your institution. Are you a librarian, a faculty member, student, or would you classify yourself as something else? We'll give you a second to respond there while Professor Voss sets up her screen for us to view. All right, let's go ahead and close this poll and take a look at the results here. Professor Voss, we're seeing that most of our attendees are librarians, 54%. A good amount of faculty members as well, 38%, and a handful of people who would classify themselves as student or other.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. I hope that some of what I share this afternoon will be helpful for those of you who teach classes, but also for the librarians who help faculty figure out how to use archives in their classes. Just a little overview of what I'm going to be discussing this afternoon. I'm going to be talking specifically about an assignment that I created for a class for English majors. But I hope that the things I share will be helpful for those of you who are teaching in other areas. So I'm going to share with you some of my goals for doing a digital archives assignment in the seminar with English majors.
And Professor
I'll,
Voss, may I interrupt for just a moment? Could you make sure you're sharing your screen with us there? That way we can follow your slides with you.
I am sorry.
Not
Is
a
that
problem. It
showing?
just popped up.
Okay. So I'm going to share my goals for doing this assignment. I will describe how I set up the digital archives assignment. I'll share some of what students gained from the experience, and then to wrap up, I'll share some tips for applying this idea in other areas or other courses for those who are thinking about ways to implement this in a different kind of situation. So first of all, why did I decide to use a digital archives assignment? My first reason, frankly, was because I could. I teach at a small liberal arts university in Western North Carolina. Our library does not have a rare books room, and we don't have easy access to a major research library where I could show students the joy of working in an archive. But we do have subscriptions to a number of digital archives, and when I came to Lenoir-Rhyne, I was very excited to find that we had a number of archives that were very useful to me in my research. Specifically, Early American Imprints was an archive that I used extensively while working on my dissertation. I was fortunate that my university had the microcard collection of Early American Imprints, and I have time combing through those microcards in doing my research. And I really enjoyed using that archive, and I wanted to find a way to share some of that with my students. So I kept thinking about ways that I could incorporate this archive into a class. And specifically, I started thinking about how it might help with student engagement. I was really hopeful that having my students work with archives, with rare books, old books, they would get engaged in the work that they were doing. I also hoped it would help with research skills development. This was an area that my program identified as something our students needed help with. Our students were getting to their senior seminar experience, and they didn't have the research skills that we hoped they would have, and so we were teaching them things that they should have learned in earlier classes. So we as a program are looking for ways to incorporate more research skills development in earlier classes, and I thought that this assignment might really help with that. And then finally, I was hoping to give my students a sense of their work being connected somehow to the real world. I wanted to give them a sense of what scholars actually do and give them a chance to think about their work as being part of a larger scholarly world rather than just a paper they wrote for an English class that they turned into their professor and then it just sort of disappeared. And I was hoping that giving them a sense of doing work, a kind of work that scholars do, they would get a chance to feel what it was like to be a scholar.
Professor Voss, let's take an opportunity here to learn more about everyone's experiences with primary sources. So here's our second poll question. Go ahead and tell us, how have you used primary sources in the past year? And many of these may apply, so go ahead and check the ones that apply to you. Did you help students find primary sources for an assignment? Did you require them to use primary sources? Perhaps you've used primary sources as part of your own presentation or lecture, as part of bibliographic instruction, or for your own research. We'll give you a second to answer there. And remember, go ahead and check all that apply to you. I see a few more answers coming in here. Okay, let's go ahead and close this poll and take a look at the results. It looks like most of you, 81%, have helped students find primary sources for an assignment. And then many of you have also used primary sources yourself as part of a presentation or lecture, as part of bibliographic instruction, or for your own research. And it looks like about a third of today's audience has required students to use primary sources for an assignment, like Professor Voss has. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you. That's great. It's great that so many of you have had the opportunity to help students get into primary sources, and that that you've required students to use as well. Often it seems like we use primary sources for our own research, but then in our classes we tend to use modern editions and anthologies and textbooks and things that are easily accessible, and our students maybe don't get the joy of working with an archive that in the primary sources that we get as scholars. So the course that I designed around this assignment was Colonial American Literature, and for this particular semester, the course description read like this. This course will introduce students to some of the concerns of literature from the colonial period through 1800 in what is now the United States, through a sampling of colonial texts and through a study of the transmission of colonial texts. In addition to studying several works of colonial literature in modern editions, students will create their own editions of texts. My program is a skills-based, an outcomes-based program, not a content-based program. So we do not have survey courses. Because this wasn't a survey course, I had the flexibility to play around with what was on the syllabus and how I was going to get to the outcomes of the course. I did need to introduce them to some of the concerns, as I said in my course description, or some of the themes and some of the features of literature from the colonial period. But I didn't have to cover specific literature, so that freed me up to be creative in designing this course. So we began the class by reading together several colonial texts. We read Alvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's Relación, and Mary Rowlandson's The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, and a few other texts. We read them in modern editions, and we read the text itself and did what English majors do with those texts. We looked at the imagery, at the word choice, at what happens in the text, at how the characters or the persona are portrayed in the text. We did all of those things, those close reading things that we do as English majors. But we also looked at the other materials in the editions that usually we don't bring into the classroom. So we read the critical introductions, the note on a text, we looked at supplementary materials, and I ordered editions that had a fair amount of other materials in them, so we could think about how these other materials help us in understanding a text and what kinds of decisions the editors made in creating these editions. And after reading through several texts and looking at how they came to us as modern texts, I then turned to the archival assignment. And for that project, the first task the students had to do was select a text from Early American Imprints. Early American Imprints is a module within America's historical imprints, which you see on the screen. For those of you who aren't familiar with Early American Imprints, I'll just describe it briefly. It's also called the Evans Collection, or Early American Imprints Series 1. This is a collection of texts published in what is now the United States from the colonial period up to 1800. It includes copies of original publications. So these are copies of old books, and sometimes they are somewhat corrupted because the only edition that still exists has markings on the pages or has rips. A lot of them have comments, marginalia, inscriptions, things like that, which to me just adds to the joy of looking at old books. And my students enjoyed that too. It gave them a sense that these were real books and that real people held these in their hands at one time. And there are a variety of texts included in Early American Imprints. There's narrative and poetry and sermons and pamphlets and all kinds of things. So I had to demonstrate to my students how to navigate the archive. I several examples of different kinds of things that are available and gave them some thoughts of how to search and how to browse through the archive, so that they could play around in there and find something that appealed to them. And then I let them go, and they had to find a text that they wanted to work with. Once a student identified a text, she had to transcribe the text and make editorial choices. So was she going to keep the original spelling or update it? Was she going to change the punctuation or keep what in some cases seemed idiosyncratic in the mechanics? So she had to make those kinds of choices, and then she had to add footnotes or endnotes to help the modern reader understand the text, which meant thinking about what things in this text are difficult to understand and what kinds of information do I need to add so that the modern reader can access the text. And finally, she had to do some composing as well. She had to write a critical introduction to the text and also a note on the text explaining her editorial choices. There were additional options as well. Some students added some of the other materials that we had seen in our course texts, maps, timelines, bibliographies of text for further reading. Some of them added supplemental materials that they thought complemented their text. Many of them added images from the original publication, particularly the title page. And so I ended up with products that looked something like this: a table of contents listing the inclusions, a critical introduction, the transcription of the text, and as I said, usually a picture of the original title page. They really found those title pages fascinating, so they liked including those. In order to get to this final product, there were other resources that they needed to use as well. So I introduced them to WorldCat because I wanted them to work with texts of which no modern edition existed. So once a student identified a text in Early American Imprints that he wanted to work with, he had to go to WorldCat and look it up and see if it existed in a modern edition. And they enjoyed getting to know that resource as well. Most of them had never heard of it, and they kind of enjoyed what information that gave them access to. There were a number of reference materials that they all needed access to. Material on the history of the time period and specifically on the history of publication, history of the book during the time, and those things I made available to them through reserves in our library. They also really needed scaffolding of their assignments. When I first described the assignment to them at the beginning of the semester, it was a bit overwhelming. It seemed like a huge project. I broke it down into smaller pieces with due dates periodically throughout the semester, and that made it much more manageable and kept them on task. And then finally, I assigned them to working groups. And they met with their groups regularly to share ideas, to ask questions, to read each other's work. And these groups were really very useful. They helped each other. They often could help track down a historical question or a source for each other. Sometimes one of them had a question and another one had encountered the information in his research, and so they could share those things. And they served as peer writing groups as well, and so they read each other's work and commented on each other's work as they went. We also met as a full class. And so sometimes when the working groups ran into a question that they couldn't answer, they would bring those to a full class and we would try to work through them together as a class.
Professor Voss, could I ask
Yes.
a moment? We had a question about the feasible length of the original text. What do you recommend as far as assigning the original text when it comes to length for students?
That is a really good question. I encourage students to pick short text, and there are a number of short texts that were published during the colonial period. And I did encourage them to try to stick to shorter texts because of the transcribing. I had a couple of students who chose things that were quite long, and it took them a long time to do the transcription. But really a text that's maybe 30 pages or so is ideal. It gives them enough to work with without being so overwhelming. That's a really good question. Thank you. So the results were, in general, amazing. I really was impressed with the work that my students did and what they produced. So here's one example. This was an execution narrative, and the student who stumbled on this found it fascinating that there was a tradition of taking down the story of a criminal who was about to be executed and writing up that story. And so she did a lot of research into this idea of execution narratives and the larger idea of dual authorship. So you can see that in her introduction there. She looked at this idea of that story being verbally told to someone who then wrote it and what that did to the way it was narrated. They did a great job of working with their texts. They worked with a great variety of sources. I had expected them to gravitate toward texts that sort of looked familiar, things that seemed like something they already knew, but they went in lots of different directions. So as I mentioned, this was an execution narrative. I had students who chose various religious texts, sermons that were published, oratory that was published. I had students who looked at educational materials. So this next example was a book that was used for educational purposes, and this student found this fascinating. It's entitled The History of Little King Pippin, with an account of the melancholy death of 4 naughty boys who were devoured by wild beasts. And she just found it fascinating how these stories were used for an educational setting, stories that we would not tell our young children now. And so she really looked into the context of this piece and what other kinds of educational materials were used. And you can see on her table of contents she included supplementary materials that were other educational texts used around the same time, so that she could discuss in her introduction then a comparison of this text to other sources that were used for education. So they took different approaches in doing the research because the research was not easy, and that really pushed them to think about what they wanted to know about the text they were working with. So, did the experience meet my expectations? In terms of student engagement, yes, absolutely. They were very engaged in the work they did. For the most part, I had one student who just sort of chose not to participate. The rest of the students were very engaged in the work they were doing. They really took ownership of their projects. In terms of research skills development, again, absolutely. This was probably the biggest gain in this process, and I'll talk a little more specifically about what they learned in just a moment. In terms of the real-world application, I'd say sort of. I had set up a plan to have the best products published on our university website. And so I chose, I think at the end of the semester, there were 4 that became an archive on our university website. We have since changed websites, and the archive no longer exists. The idea was that students could publish their work and could access these texts. Now, in all honesty, probably nobody was trying to access these particular texts, but the idea that someone else might access their work really did have an impact on the students. And they did get this experience of what it was like to work like a scholar, but I'm not sure that part worked out quite as well as I was hoping it would. So what students learned? First and foremost, research skills. They had to greatly expand the way they approached a research question and what questions they asked. These were all English majors, almost all English majors. There were a couple of middle grades or middle school language arts education majors who take a fair number of English courses. So they all had pretty good English research skills. They knew how to go to the MLA bibliography and look for an author and a title and see what other people were saying about a text. But that didn't work with these texts because in most cases nothing came up in the MLA bibliography. So they had to rethink their research strategy, and they had to ask different questions and look at different approaches into their research. They also had to become familiar with other databases, particularly databases that helped them with historical context. Because they couldn't look at literary analyses of their texts, they had to take other angles into what they were doing. And some of them looked at similar literature from the time period, or looked at genre studies, but many of them looked at the historical context as a way of interpreting their text, and so they did a lot of research in history. They also learned to rely on each other. They would ask research questions and help each other with finding answers. And this was particularly true with the footnotes. They would come across something in their text that didn't have an easy answer, and so they'd start asking each other, and as a class we would do some brainstorming about how could we find an answer for that question, or how could we find information to explain that that piece so that a modern audience will understand it. And they got the sense that research isn't something that one person does alone in the library, but that it is a collaborative effort. Critical thinking skills. This was not something that I explicitly stated as a goal when I set out with this project, but it's pretty much always a goal in English classes. And they really did expand their critical thinking skills in part through the close analysis of a written text. They couldn't skim their text because they had to transcribe them, so they had to read them very, very carefully. And that experience of analyzing the text really heightened their critical thinking skills. And also in thinking about how to approach a text and how to change their research, it really made them think critically and think creatively, which was really nice to see. Content knowledge. They learned a great deal about something fairly small in their area, but they also learned a variety through exposure to what their classmates were working on. And so they learned a lot, particularly about the people in the society. Not quite as much about texts, but they learned a lot about the concerns of the colonial period and what kinds of texts were out there and what people were writing and reading and circulating. And so they learned a lot from each other and through the research that they did. They also learned to pay very close attention to their writing. And again, this wasn't something that I explicitly set out to achieve. But their writing in their final products was so much better than it usually is in a term paper. And I think there are two reasons for this. I think the transcription experience of paying such close attention to somebody else's writing really made them pay close attention to their own writing. And then I think the other thing was that I told them some of them would be published on the internet. And so this thought that somebody other than their professor was going to be reading the text really made them pay attention to their writing. So the writing was really well crafted, it was very clean, and they worked hard to develop their ideas and explain things in a way that could communicate with an audience, whereas often in term papers they kind of take shortcuts at the end of the semester, and I didn't get that feeling with these final products. And then finally, they learned what scholars do, or at least something about what scholars do, and particularly the way that scholarship can function in a community, in the way that scholars learn from each other and build on each other's knowledge, and the collaboration that comes in scholarship, even when somebody's doing an independent project. And that collaborative effort really was something that was a sort of a pleasant surprise that came out of this assignment.
These are really great learning outcomes. Professor Voss, let's spend another minute here to learn from our audience. Of these learning outcomes that Professor Voss just described, which do you consider most important for students at your institution? Go ahead and vote in our poll here, and we know that these are very important outcomes, so we decided we should let you apply, check all that apply. So kind of narrow it down to your top 2 or 3, check those off, and let us know what you think are most important for students at your institution. We'll give you a minute to reply there. Remember, you can also submit questions using the chat box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Our results are coming in. Go ahead and check off the learning outcomes that you consider to be most important. Okay, let me share those results with you. Almost everyone, 85%, saying that research skills are very important to them, followed closely by critical thinking skills at 81%. Content knowledge, attention to writing, and what scholars do, that community of scholarship, also important, but it seems like the ones that are rising to the top are research skills and critical thinking skills.
Thank you. Well, I put those first, so I'd say those are probably the 2 that I was most impressed with their development in as well. Although the attention to writing, as I mentioned, I also was very impressed with. So this is what students did learn. On to what my students didn't learn. For some reason, it's not going forward. There we go. what they didn't learn, content knowledge, the breadth of content knowledge that can be packed into a survey course. I had to sacrifice a bit of what I might otherwise have taught in order to make room for this large project. And so they did not learn as much about certain texts as I would normally have put into a Colonial American Lit class. So we couldn't read as many texts together so that they had time to do this project. But I think the trade-off was worth it. The skills that they gained and the engagement in what they were doing, I think, was worth the trade-off of not having as much material covered. Student reactions. It was hard work. So the students made it very clear that this project was very hard work. I heard that from them. They complained to each other. They complained to my colleagues. So I did hear that fairly often, that it was hard work. But also, it was also very clear how engaged they were in the project. We have a fairly small program, so our students know each other well, and they know the faculty well, and they tend to talk to us about each other's classes. And I heard a lot from my colleagues about how much their students were talking about this project and how much they were learning from it, how much ownership they took of the project. So they were very engaged in it. They also learned a lot, and they were aware that they learned a lot through this process. And again, that was something I heard from them throughout the semester. And then finally, a sense of self-worth, their confidence in what they could do and pride in their final products came through very clearly. That they felt like they did something valuable in doing this assignment, and that was really nice to hear as well. So I'll share a few of the comments from student evaluations that get to some of these ideas. We were given our own freedom to choose a document and how we wanted to research our subject. This freedom was really educational and allowed us to branch out and explore. So they appreciated the fact that they could take ownership, that they could choose what they wanted to focus on and what direction they wanted to go in. I loved doing the archival project at the end of the semester. It was very different than the projects we have had in other classes and gave us a unique opportunity. So they enjoyed the fact that this was different than things they were doing in their other classes. The archival project was ridiculously challenging. There's that sense that it was very hard work, and that did come through. But then there were comments like this: the archival project was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot from it. So it was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun. It was a big challenge. And I did really challenge them. And for most of them, they rose to the challenge, and they learned a lot and appreciated it. And then this comment is probably my favorite comment on a course evaluation ever. I had so much fun working with the text I chose. I felt like I was able to use all the skills I have learned as an English major in one project. Even though it was a lot of work and a lot of writing, I feel proud of myself for having accomplished something. That sense that the student could bring together everything she already knew and apply it and develop something that she took ownership of was really heartwarming at the end of the semester to read that that was the reaction that a lot of students had. What I learned: intensive work for students means intensive work for me. When I planned this class, I anticipated an enrollment of about 12, and I ended up with 23 students enrolling in the class. And somewhere around halfway through the semester, it occurred to me that that meant at the end of the semester, I'd have 23 projects to grade. During the semester, it was a lot of work because I met with the students individually. I kept tabs on the work they were doing. I helped them with individual issues in their projects. And then at the end of the semester, the grading was, I'll say like the student did, ridiculously challenging, to grade essentially 23 books at the end of the semester and compare them to the original text, because it was looking at their transcriptions as well as all of the other materials. It was a lot of work.
Professor Voss, while you're on that point, could I ask, this is a question from Jeremy, how much class time was dedicated to this project? And he says both in terms of in-class time and the overall semester.
That's a good question. We spent about 2/3 of the semester reading texts in common and studying those texts. But about halfway through the semester, we actually started with some of the initial work on the archival project. So there's a little bit of overlap between doing the last common text and the students starting on their work. And then the last third of the semester, we devoted our time to working on the archival project. And what I did, it was a 2-day-a-week class. And so what I did is every Tuesday we met as a full class and talked about issues we were running into, and I kept tabs on them, and they had various smaller pieces due on those Tuesdays. And then on Thursdays, they met with their working groups. And sometimes we met in this classroom. More often we met in the library where they could spread out a bit and they could help each other. And sometimes they just all sat at a table and worked together. But that was time dedicated to working on the project within the class, with me there to answer questions as they came up and that kind of thing. So thank you. That's a good question. So I will say the last third of the semester, there wasn't a lot of prep work for me, but I was meeting with the students. Aside from the class meetings, I was meeting with them individually as well. And I made sure that I met with each one of them individually, kind of at each stage of the project, which made for a lot of individual meetings too. So in the future, I might make this a group project to reduce the burden on the students and on me. Or I might reduce the transcription portion of the assignment, and I can't quite decide. As I mentioned earlier, I encourage students to choose something short so that the transcription didn't take so long. But some of them just fell in love with long works, and so they transcribed 100 pages of a colonial text, which took a lot of time. They didn't need to do 100 pages to get the benefits of that portion of the assignment, although the end results were beautiful in part because they had a transcription of the full text. So I don't know if I want to lose the final product being really a whole product or not. By making it a group project, they could divvy up the transcription portion of it, and that wouldn't take as long. So that might be an approach to take in the future. A few tips for those of you who are thinking about creating a digital archives assignment, or for those librarians who help faculty in thinking through how to use digital archives. When creating an assignment like this, I suggest using course texts that offer examples of the kind of work that students will do. So my students had several examples of different ways that an old text had been turned into a modern edition. So they could look at different styles of apparatus, different inclusions, different decisions, editorial decisions, and think about what they wanted to do. And they could look at those as what their final product should sort of look like, and that was really helpful. Demonstrate how to use the archive. Our students are very savvy on the internet, but most of them haven't had much access to this kind of archive. And so they're used to Googling something and maybe checking out the first one or two things that come up. I really encouraged them to dig a little more deeply into the archive. And so whichever archive you or faculty member uses, you want to make sure the students have some instruction on how to get the most out of browsing through the archive. Scaffold the assignment in steps, especially something this elaborate. It feels overwhelming to students. So by creating smaller steps along the way with deadlines for different pieces of it, a student can be sure that she is on track and get feedback and not have to do the whole thing all at once. And along those lines, giving individual feedback along the way, that was very important for my students. That first they had to select a text, and then I made sure that they all chose texts that I thought would work okay. Didn't want any of them heading off into something that was going to be just much too difficult to work with. And then once they had a text and they started transcribing, then we met to talk about how the transcription was going. And so giving them feedback along the way and giving them a chance to reflect on what they were doing along the way was really very helpful. And then finally, allowing collaboration or mutual support of some kind. Those working groups really helped students in feeling like they were doing what they needed to do and that they weren't doing it alone and that everyone was struggling with the same kinds of things. And so allowing some of that collaboration and giving them that that experience of collaborating with others is also very helpful. And finally, have fun with it. Share with students your own experiences, your joys and mishaps in doing research, and encourage students to share. My students liked sharing, especially when they were in the process of choosing text. They liked sharing the kinds of things they came across and the things they were attracted to and the things that they were surprised by. And also, if this is something new to you, just dive in and learn with the students. This was the first time I had done such an elaborate experience like this with students, and I wasn't entirely sure what to expect, but sometimes those things result in the best classes. So give it a try, dive in, see how it goes, because it really can be really enjoyable for the students and also for the instructor who gets to watch the students and all of that they're learning through this kind of a process.
Good advice. Thank you so much, Professor Voss, for sharing that experience using primary sources with your students. We've had some really good questions coming in, so I want to jump right into those. One of, I guess you could call this a suggestion from Emily. Why not ask a librarian to teach students how to use the digital archive? How could you collaborate with the library on this assignment?
Oh, I think that's a fantastic suggestion. As I mentioned, this happened to be an archive that I know pretty well, so I was comfortable demonstrating it to my students, but certainly getting a librarian involved is fantastic. And we do collaborate with our librarians at Lenoir-Rhyne, and we have a librarian who's sort of assigned to the English program, and he supports us in a lot of what we do. And certainly I could have had him come into the class and explain how to use the archive and also explain what other kinds of resources are available. And that's a great suggestion because that reminds students that the librarian is also a good resource. And my students did go, I should have mentioned this earlier, my students did go to our librarians and ask some of these questions that they were having trouble tracking down. And our librarians loved this assignment because they enjoyed having that chance to work on some of those little questions that students were trying to puzzle out.
It sounds like the library is a good partner.
Yes, definitely.
Let's take another question here, this one from Kathleen. What are your thoughts on having the professor also work on a group project, working with the students and problem solving along the way with them?
Well, that's an interesting suggestion. If I'm understanding the question correctly, you're asking about having the professor maybe be part of a group. And I'm always hesitant to do that because what I find is that as soon as I'm part of a group, my students shut down and they expect me to do the leading. But I certainly could imagine doing a similar project with the students. So, for instance, picking out a text of my own and doing the transcription and working through footnotes and all of that along with my students so that I could be one of the participants. I think that's a great idea.
Great, thank you. A reminder that now is also a great time to download any of the 3 handouts you have access to. You can get those under the handouts section in the gray GoToWebinar control panel. Another question here from Michelle. Your students all created print editions of digital versions of colonial texts. So have you or your students ever explored the possibility of creating digital editions of these originally printed texts? So think, editions that might make use of electronic features such as hyperlinks, multimodal writing, things like that.
That, again, is a great suggestion. I did not do that with this class because I wasn't especially familiar with that kind of technology. Thanks to some professional development through Lenoir-Rhyne in the last year, I've become much more familiar with that, and we're exploring in the English department how to do more of these things. And I think that would be a great thing. Instead of having footnotes, for instance, we could hyperlinks to sources that elucidate certain issues, that kind of thing. I really like that. In fact, I think I might explore that. We're really trying to build our students' multimodal capabilities, and that might be a way to help this project help with developing some of those skills.
Great. Just out of personal curiosity, how did you come up with this in the first place?
I guess there were a couple of things. One was that in graduate school I did a similar project for a class that I took. We had to do some of this editorial work on a text. It wasn't a colonial text, it wasn't an out-of-print text, so I didn't have quite the same research issues going on, but it was the same sort of experience, and I enjoyed it, and it's a different way of approaching a text, so that was sort of in my head. And also, I was contemplating doing an edition of a text that I researched for my dissertation and that had never been reprinted. And so I was looking into kind of what might be involved in that, and I think that all kind of got me thinking. And then, as I mentioned, we were trying to come up with ways of improving our students' research skills, and I really thought this would help with that. So all of those things kind of came together to develop this idea.
Well, and based on those student reviews, it sounds like it certainly made an impact on them.
Yes.
Anything else you'd like to add at this point, Professor Voss?
Well, see, one of the things that comes up when you try to do a project like this is that people kind of protest, oh, there are so many things in my class that I have to cover, and I think that's something you have to think about is what are the intents of the class? And if the intent is to help students engaged and have them building skills, then there's room for a project like that. If the intent is to cover a lot of content, then this might not be quite an appropriate project. But there might be smaller ways to get them involved in archival research.
Great. So kind of going back to that mission of the course.
Yes.
Thank you again to Professor Voss for really opening our eyes to creating this digital archive assignment and those learning outcomes, the benefits for students that, as we saw, were pretty incredible. As we conclude, you're going to see a short survey pop up on your screen, and we would certainly value your feedback, and your responses help to ensure we're providing useful and engaging webinars. So if you'll take a minute to respond to that, we would really appreciate it. If we didn't get to your question today or to ask Readex a question at any time, please email us readexmarketing@readex.com. We really appreciate you being with us for this part of the afternoon, and we hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.